Welcome back. In this section, we're going to learn about all things related to the small intestine. So the first thing to know about the small intestine is it's about 20 feet long. And what's going to happen is you are going to have about 3 liters of stuff entering the small intestine every day. If you think we've got about 1.5 liters of saliva, we've got all the fluids we've been drinking, and we've got our gastric secretion. So all that gets dumped into the small intestine. And then the small intestine is going to go ahead and add another 1 liter or 2. So we're going to have about 1.5 gallons of stuff slushing around in your small intestine. And it's going to take at least 12 hours for the small intestine to do its job. So we are looking at an overnight process, minimal, for it to handle the dinner of the evening before. The blood flow to the small intestine comes completely through the superior mesenteric artery and it's drained by the superior mesenteric vein. And so you should be learning more about that in lab. Looking at the 20 feet of the small intestine, we divide it into 3 distinct areas. The first portion, which is about only 1 foot long, is known as the duodenum. Okay, please don't say duodenum. That's like saying potato instead of potato. Okay, so duodenum. The second portion, which is super important, is called the jejunum. And then the third and final portion, which is going to lead us to the large intestine, that's called the ileum. So looking at the surface of the small intestine, if you were to cut it open and lay it flat, what you would notice is there's a lot of bumps on the surface. And so we have 3 different structural modifications. So we'll start with the biggest bumps, the middle-sized bumps, and then the smallest bumps. So looking at this picture on the bottom, you clearly can see that this is not a smooth surface. So each one of these is a fold, a circular fold, which is known as a plica circulare. And these are up to 1 centimeter in height. So if you imagine fluid cruising along, it would take quite the wave to be able to get over these. Yes, these are speed bumps to slow things down in your small intestine. We don't want it zooming along, because if it zooms along, then we don't have time for any type of digestion and or absorption to occur. Looking at the drawing up above, which is showing this circular fold or plica circulare, what you can see that it's just mucosa and submucosa in that fold. The muscularis externa layer does not go into the fold. So let's take that and look at the fold, and you can see that there's like little finger-like projections on each of these folds, and that's what this center structure is. And each of those finger-like projections is called a villus. So we have millions of villi in the 20 feet of the small intestine. And as opposed to the plica circulare, which were 1 centimeter in height, each villus is about 1 millimeter in height. But they are super important because in that areolar connective tissue is where you are going to find the capillary beds where things can be absorbed into. And nestled among that capillary bed, we're going to have this green structure, which means it's part of what organ system? That's right. It is part of the lymphatic system, and specifically, this is a lacteal, a lymph capillary. So now if we look at the surface of each lacteal, what you'll notice is we have beautiful epithelium all along the surface with these little white cells every now and then. Each one of those white cells is a little goblet cell for a little bit of mucus secretion. But those other cells are not flat-topped either. They have the third surface modification, and that is the microvilli. And if you recall from the beginning of this learning anatomy, microvilli increase the surface area, which means that cell is either secreting a bunch or absorbing a bunch. And in the small intestine, we've got both activities going on. And so these are about 1 micrometer in height. So Here is a close-up looking at the epithelial surface of villi in the small intestine. So between that and the cartoon drawing, you should be able to figure out what the epithelium is. And each of these little white punched out spaces that at first you might think, is that adipose cell? No, each one of those is the goblet cell full of the mucin ready to be secreted. Okay, so when we take all three of those surface modifications, and if we would flatten it all out, what we would realize is that 20-foot segment of small intestine, which has a diameter about this, actually has the entire surface area of a tennis court, meaning we're going to have some major digestion and absorbing going on in the small intestine. It is not 20 feet by an inch. It is a tennis court. So looking at some more functions of the small intestine, in addition to peristalsis, there's another movement in the small intestine known as segmentation, which is a local churning. And so as foodstuffs come along, we may have some like this enzyme there and this foodstuff there. And if they never connect with each other, they're not going to do their job. So kind of envision if you were making brownies, you jumped in the brownie mix and then you jumped in the oil and the water on the other side. You got to kind of mix the two things together. So these two section areas are going to kind of mix up a little bit over here, and then these next ones are going to mix up, and eventually you'll get this entire homogeneous mixture, which you would be happy to put in the oven and then scarf down later in the evening. So that's what segmentation is. In addition to segmentation, we are going to be doing digestion of all three foodstuffs. So if you recall, when proteins are digested, what do you end up with? What are they made out of? Amino acids. And when carbohydrates, what do we end up there? Simple sugars, like glucose. And fat, remember, fatty acids. Okay, so now that I've refreshed your memory, let's talk about absorption and what's going where. So what's this structure a picture of? Hopefully you haven't forgotten. That's right, this is a villus with its epithelium. So we've got mucosa, submucosa here, we've got a capillary bed, and in the middle we have our lacteal. So into the blood vessels, what will be absorbed are those simple sugars and the amino acids. And you're going, well, what about those fatty acids? Well, does fat like water? No, so it's not going to go into the watery blood. Where the fatty acids have to go is someplace else, but also into the blood vessels. This is where our vitamins and our minerals are going to go. Just wanted to mention that. Well, most of our vitamins, because some of our vitamins are also not water soluble, but they're fat soluble. So into the lacteals, we're going to have 4 very important vitamins. Our fat soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, which we've mentioned before. Vitamin A for vision, vitamin D for bones, vitamin E, the antioxidant, and vitamin K, which is for the clotting process. And also our fatty acids. So now we have everything absorbed, because remember those lacteals, they go to lymphatic vessels, yada, yada, yada. Eventually, from the lymphatic ducts, they're going to be dumped back into the bloodstream, way up here, right before the brachiocephalic veins form. So let's go back to those 3 areas of the small intestine and see what they are doing, what they look like, and how you can tell where one is and the next one is. So starting right here, this is where the stomach is cut off. So this is your pyloric sphincter. So the duodenum is a C-shaped structure. It goes around the head of the pancreas. It's about 1 foot long. And then it will make a sharp curve to come back intraperitoneal. Because even though the stomach is intraperitoneal and the duodenum, this first portion is intraperitoneal, it then dives retroperitoneal because the pancreas is retroperitoneal and the duodenum is going to be picking up secretions from the pancreas. So it starts intraperitoneal, then goes retroperitoneal. So as soon as it crosses the midline going onto the left side of the body again, and it makes this curve to come back intraperitoneal, that's the end of the duodenum right there. So once it's intraperitoneal, that first portion is of the intraperitoneal small intestine now is going to be called the jejunum. So the jejunum kind of starts up here on the left side, and it tends to be more the upper part. All right, now looking at a real person's small intestine, you cannot tell where from the outside the jejunum ends and the ileum starts because it's not color-coded like this. It kind of looks the same. And so at some point, the jejunum gives way to the ileum, but we can always tell where the ileum ends because the ileum leads us to the large intestine in the right lower quadrant of your abdomen. So we're always going to have ileum in the right lower quadrant, and we're always going to have jejunum in the left upper quadrant. So duodenum, mostly retroperitoneal. I explained why and showed you where that happened. Jejunum, super important. Of the three parts, this is where the majority of our chemical digestion and nutrient absorption is going to occur. And the ileum, it will do some digestion and absorption, but its big claim to fame is that terminal part, as in the last 6 to 12 inches of the ileum. That is where vitamin B12 with its attached intrinsic factor gets absorbed into your bloodstream. All right, let's look a little bit closer at the small intestine. If you remember in the stomach, we had a flat surface where we had gastric pits and then we had glands down below. Small intestine is different. We have those villi going upwards, and then we have really small crypts. When we look at the bottom part of the crypt, this is where we are going to find our stem cells undergoing mitosis, and they are giving rise to all of our other types of cells. And as the cells mature, they move upward from the crypt, and then they'll eventually move upward to the top of the villus. And it can take anywhere up to a week for them to be sloughed. So in other words, your small intestine cells on the epithelium, they turn over really quickly. I will point out that one of the cell types actually doesn't go up towards the villus. When it is produced, it actually goes down and sits in the bottom of the crypt. So let's look at 4 different types of cells once again. So here we have our villus with somewhere around 3,500 cells, and here we have our crypt, which is not actually in the right proportion because it only has about 250 cells. Okay. So all the blue cells in this picture, these are the epithelial cells, so they're going to be absorbing. They're not doing the secreting, they're doing the absorbing. We have goblet cells interspersed among the epithelial cells. These are the bright green ones, and so these are once again secreting a mucus, which is in this case alkaline as well, because we're trying to negate the acidic chyme that has entered in the small intestine, and this alkaline mucus is trying to protect those surface epithelial cells from becoming ulcerated. Looking into the deepest part of the crypt, these dark green ones, these are the Paneth cells. So these are the ones that on the previous slide were the yellow cells. And Paneth cells are interesting. They carry a few things. They have antimicrobial granules as well as the lysozyme antimicrobial things we talked about before. And so their whole job is if bacteria get stuck down in these little crypts, the bacteria won't be invading through the mucosa. So they're trying to keep you healthy. And lastly, these purple cells, these are the enteroendocrine cells of the small intestine. And there are many different types of enteroendocrine cells, each with their own name, because each cell type can only produce one substance, one hormone. So we're going to have some enteroendocrine cells which secrete gastrin. Yes, more gastrin. It's going to have the same job it did in the stomach. Some are going to secrete something called secretin, and some are going to secrete something called cholecystokinin. But I'm not going to make you learn that word cholecystokinin. This is one that you can call CCK. But just remember that word cholecyst, that refers to the gallbladder, and then you'll understand what CCK does. And then there are others we're just not going to talk about. So looking at these substances, let's kind of like put all the substances, like what's making them being secreted and what do they do once they are secreted. So when gastric hydrochloric acid enters through the pyloric sphincter into the duodenum, then one type of enteroendocrine cell in the duodenum will release secretin. When dietary fat enters, when it hits the jejunum, we have cells there that are going to release cholecystokinin or CCK. Now, secretin and cholecystokinin, they each stimulate different parts of the pancreas, so we are going to get pancreatic juices out of the two of them. In addition, cholecystokinin causes bile to be produced and the gallbladder to contract. So the gallbladder contains bile. So if you remember, the cholecyst refers to gallbladder, then you'll understand this whole bile gallbladder contraction. But both secretin and cholecystokinin act on the pancreas, albeit differently from each other. So here is just a little visual if you are confused just looking at words, or if you're more of a visual person, stop and read and understand the visuals. So let me kind of sum things up and add a couple other details. When we are talking about digestion, there's going to be 5 major hormones that regulate it. The first one we've talked about twice already, it's gastrin. In the stomach, the stimulus for gastrin secretion was food, specifically protein, entering the stomach, and it also secreted from vagus nerve stimulation. In the duodenum, when we have large amounts of protein which haven't been digested, then the duodenum will continue to release more gastrin. And what gastrin does is, its big thing in the stomach is to make the chief cells and the parietal cells do their secretion, so it can release pepsin to start our protein digestion. But in addition, it also increases the gastric motility, so you have a more robust peristalsis happening in the stomach. The second hormone, secretin. And the stimulus for this was the acidic chyme entering the duodenum. And so this is going to cause bile production in the liver, but its biggie is it has the pancreas kick out alkaline secretions so that we can raise the pH of the chyme so it does not ulcerate the small intestine. The third hormone, which we haven't talked about yet, is known as gastric inhibitory peptide, which you can abbreviate GIP. And it's also called glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, in that it is a tropic hormone which makes beta cells secrete insulin, but it's dependent on glucose levels. So the stimulus for this are fat and carbs, especially glucose, small amino acid monomers entering the small intestine. And it's going to stimulate insulin release. The fourth hormone is our friend cholecystokinin, CCK. So when chymes in the duodenum, especially if there are lipids or partially digested protein, you're going to have CCK being produced, which increases production of enzymes, not the alkaline secretions, but enzymes from the pancreas, which we'll talk about. But for right now, secretin, cholecystokinin, pancreatic secretions, okay? In addition, it causes the gallbladder to contract and relaxes the sphincter of Vater so that bile being produced can enter the small intestine, as well as those pancreatic juices being produced, because they enter together. And the last hormone, which we haven't talked about yet either, and that's called vasoactive intestinal peptide. So vaso refers to blood vessels. So what this does is it makes your blood vessels dilate, okay? And so intestinal secretions increase, blood vessels dilate, even more foodstuffs are going to be absorbed. So at this point, stop it, write in all your different words to discuss, put everything in there, how everything relates to everything else, and put them in the right parts of the alimentary canal. All right, I'm glad you worked through that. And if you did, go back and do it. One more topic to talk about with the small intestine, and that has to do with lactose and its enzyme lactase. As you recall, ACE means an enzyme, and OS means it is a sugar. So yes, lactose is a sugar. Specifically, it's a disaccharide, which means it's two sugars put together. It's a glucose monomer and it's a galactose monomer. And lactase basically splits it apart. So here's the lactose being acted on by the purple enzyme, and you end up with two little simple sugars, which then are much easier to absorb because the lactose cannot be absorbed as it is. And not only can it not be absorbed, it has this big osmotic pull. So the lactose, which you know is a milk sugar, if it's not broken down, when it enters your small intestine and travels along the small intestine, it's going to suck a whole bunch of liquid into the small intestine with it. And so you're going to have all this sloshing going around, and you're going to feel like you're 3 or 4 months pregnant. And that's how it's going to continue until it reaches the large intestine. And in the distal part of the large intestine, we have bacteria. I know you knew that it wasn't sterile down there, but we've got lots of bacteria. And the bacteria will see all this lactose coming down and like, man, they digest that stuff very well. However, remember, you still have all this liquid down there. And when the bacteria digest the lactose as opposed to lactase digesting the lactose, the bacteria produce gas. So now you have gas and liquid, and you can just see this is going to lead to a wet fart, which is not a good thing. So how do you prevent this if you have if you are lactose intolerant or you have a lactase deficiency? Those two words mean the same. Well, you can take pills or put drops in your food, or if you're just drinking milk, lactose-free milk, or if you're buying ice cream, if you can read the contents of the ice cream, like you can read the words cream, milk, then it's going to have plenty of lactose. But if you start reading and you see it goes on for 12 lines and there's mostly chemicals, then you need to assume that the lactose was probably all broken down long before it was made into that ice cream substance. And some cheeses have a lot more lactose than other ones. Apparently, if they're softer, they have more, and then the harder, more aged cheeses, you are better off with those. And then also some people age out of their lactose intolerance as they get into adulthood, but then as you start becoming an older adult, apparently the amount of lactase you make goes down and you can become somewhat lactose intolerant again. And so you pretty much know, there's a big familial incidence of lactose insufficiency, and that has to do with ethnic heritage. If we look at our native populations, most of them are pretty lactose intolerant. And if you look at Central and South America, you will see a fairly high incidence of lactose intolerance, but nothing compared to the southern half of Africa and China and those Asian countries that we have the data for. As opposed to most of North America, Russia, and Europe. France is the land of more than 1,000 cheeses. But we don't hear about any cheese in, say, for instance, Japanese food, Chinese food. You don't see them making a bunch of cheese sauces, and there's good reason for that, because they all would be miserable because they just don't have the lactase. Okay, and with that, we are done with our exploration of the small intestine, and I will see you soon, as we are not going to the large intestine next, but we are going to be learning about the accessory organs that are located in the abdominal cavity. Thank you for all your hard work.